The neon sign outside of Carmine's diner had been buzzing with a low, electrical hum for the better part of a decade. It flickered in the heavy, relentless downpour of the Tuesday night rain, casting long, distorted shadows across the wet pavement. Inside, the diner smelled of stale coffee, burnt onions, and the particular kind of exhaustion that only settled in after 2 in the morning. Elena shifted her weight from one aching foot to the other, leaning against the worn Formica counter. She was 26, but her eyes held the tired wisdom of someone who had lived 3 lifetimes in the city's unforgiving underbelly. She watched the rain streak down the massive front window, the droplets tracing erratic paths through the condensation. Carmine's wasn't a place people came for the culinary experience. It was a sanctuary for the sleepless, the broken, and the dangerous. Elena knew them all. She knew the insomniac cab drivers, the third-shift nurses with hollow eyes, and the men who wore expensive suits but paid with cash that smelled vaguely of damp basements. She preferred the graveyard shift. It paid slightly better, and the quiet afforded her the space to exist without the suffocating pressure of daylight crowds. The brass bell above the heavy glass door chimed, a sharp, cheerful sound that violently contradicted the oppressive atmosphere of the night. The door swung open, bringing with it a gust of freezing wind and the damp, metallic scent of the city. The diner went dead silent. It wasn't a gradual hush. It was an instant, suffocating drop in volume. The low murmur of the cab drivers in the corner booth ceased. The clinking of forks against porcelain halted in midair. Even the sizzle of the grill in the back seemed to muffle itself. Elena didn't need to look up to know who had just walked in, but she did. Eli stood in the entryway. He was a man carved from cold, unyielding stone, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that cost more than Elena made in a year. His dark hair was slicked back, catching the harsh fluorescent light, and his eyes, dark, calculating, and utterly devoid of warmth, swept the room in a single, assessing glance. He was a ghost story whispered among the city's syndicates, a man who controlled the docks, the backroom games, and the shadows in between. But it wasn't just Eli that commanded the terrifying silence of the room. It was the creature walking beside him, a monstrous pitbull, easily weighing over 120 pounds, stood at Eli's left leg. The dog was a slate gray, its coat short and tightly stretched over thick, roping muscles. Its head was blocky and massive, marred by thin, white scars that told a history of brutal, unforgiving violence. A thick, spiked leather collar wrapped around its neck, attached to a heavy-duty chain leash that Eli held with a casual, yet white-knuckled grip. The dog didn't pant. It didn't sniff the air. It stood perfectly still, its golden, predatory eyes locking onto the patrons one by one. Elena watched from behind the counter, her hands resting flat against the cool surface. She had seen dogs like this before. Growing up in a neighborhood where dog fighting was a tragic, hidden reality, she knew the difference between a pet and a weapon. This animal was a loaded gun with a heartbeat. Eli moved toward his usual booth in the far back corner. The patrons in the adjacent booths physically shrank away, pressing themselves against the cold windows to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the dog. The pitbull's heavy paws made a low, rhythmic thudding sound against the linoleum. Thud, 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 as they passed a table where a nervous young man accidentally kicked the leg of his chair. The dog's head snapped toward the sound. A low, vibrating growl rumbled from deep within the animal's broad chest, a sound like a revving engine. The young man froze, the blood draining from his face. Eli simply tightened his grip on the chain, giving a sharp, barely perceptible tug. "Stand down." "Tighten," Eli murmured, his voice a low baritone that commanded absolute obedience. The dog held the young man's gaze for one agonizing second longer, before turning its massive head forward again. Elena grabbed a fresh carafe of coffee from the warmer. She poured a black mug, placing it on a tray along with a clean glass of water. She didn't tremble. She didn't hesitate. She walked out from behind the counter, her worn sneakers silent against the floor, and made her way toward the back booth. Eli was already seated, his back to the wall, facing the door. Titan was positioned directly under the table, a solid wall of muscle blocking anyone from getting close to his master. As Elena approached, the dog's golden eyes snapped up to her. "Evening," Elena said, her voice steady, neutral. She didn't look at the dog. She kept her eyes focused entirely on the table, setting the coffee mug down in front of Eli. Eli looked up at her, a flicker of mild surprise crossing his stoic features. Most waitresses at Carmine's refused to serve him, terrified of the beast that guarded his feet. "You're new to this shift," he stated. Not a question, but a cold observation. "I picked up Maria's hours. She had a family emergency," Elena replied smoothly. She set the water glass down. Beneath the table, Titan shifted. The heavy chain rattled ominously against the metal leg of the booth. The dog sniffed the air near Elena's knees, its hot breath seeping through the thin fabric of her jeans. Every instinct screamed at her to step back, to show fear, but she held her ground. She knew that fear was a scent, and showing it was an invitation. "He doesn't like sudden movements," Eli warned, his eyes narrowing as he watched her. He seemed to be testing her, waiting for the inevitable flinch. "Neither do I," Elena replied flatly. She pulled a small notepad from her apron. "You want the usual? Steak and eggs? Rare?" For a long moment, Eli just stared at her. The harsh diner lighting cast deep shadows under his eyes, revealing a profound, chronic exhaustion beneath his terrifying exterior. He wasn't just a boss. He was a man who lived his entire life waiting for a knife in the back. The dog was his only trust. "Yeah," Eli finally said, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave. "Rare. And a bowl of raw ground beef for him." "Coming right up," Elena said. She turned on her heel and walked back toward the kitchen, feeling the heavy golden stare of the Pitbull burning into her spine every step of the way. The hours bled into one another, marked only by the steady rhythm of the rain outside and the occasional hiss of the espresso machine. The diner remained shrouded in an uneasy quiet. Nobody wanted to be the one to break the silence and draw the attention of the man in the back booth, or worse, the monstrous animal beneath it. Elena moved through her duties with practiced efficiency. She wiped down tables, refilled sugar dispensers, and brewed fresh pots of coffee, all while keeping a subtle, peripheral watch on Eli. He hadn't touched his food. He had spent the last 2 hours staring at a series of documents spread across the table, his brow furrowed in deep, troubled concentration. Titan had finished his bowl of raw meat in 3 terrifying bites, and now rested his massive head on his heavy paws, his eyes half closed but never truly asleep. It was 3:15 a.m. when the front door burst open, shattering the fragile peace. 3 men stumbled into the diner. They were loud, uncoordinated, and reeking heavily of cheap liquor and bad decisions. Their clothes were soaked from the rain, and they were laughing uproariously at some private joke. The sound was jarring, scraping against the nerves of every patron in the room. Elena immediately tensed, grabbing a towel and stepping out from behind the counter. "Hey!" she called out, keeping her voice firm but low. "Keep it down, guys! It's late!" The largest of the 3, a burly man with a thick beard and a soaked leather jacket, waved a dismissive hand at her. "Relax, sweetheart. We just want some burgers," he slurred, stumbling forward and bumping hard against the side of a booth. The impact rattled the table, sending a half-empty glass of water plummeting to the floor. It shattered with a sharp, explosive crack that echoed through the diner like a gunshot. The reaction was instantaneous. From the back of the room, a sound erupted that froze the blood in Elena's veins. It wasn't just a bark. It was a deep, guttural roar of pure, unadulterated aggression. Titan surged forward. The heavy table Eli was sitting at violently lurched as the 120-pound Pitbull launched itself from beneath it. The heavy chain leash snapped taut with a terrifying metallic crack, yanking Eli's arm violently forward. The dog's thick nails scrabbled frantically against the linoleum, sparks seemingly flying from the sheer force of its movement. "Titan, no!" Eli bellowed, abandoning his documents and throwing his entire body weight backward to counter the dog's momentum. But the beast was beyond logic. Triggered by the sudden noise and the erratic, unpredictable movements of the drunken men, Titan's protective instincts had overridden his training. He saw threats, he saw danger to his master, and his only response was absolute violence. The three drunk men sobered instantly, screaming as they scrambled backward, slipping on the wet floor and falling over each other in a desperate bid to reach the door. Other patrons shrieked, diving over tables and hiding behind the counter. The diner dissolved into absolute pandemonium. "Get back! Everyone get the hell back! Right now!" Eli roared, the veins in his neck straining against his collar as he hauled back on the leash. Titan was a force of nature. He reared up on his hind legs, his massive chest expanding, thick ropes of saliva flying from his snapping jaws. The spiked collar bit deeply into his neck. But the dog didn't seem to feel the pain. He was lunging toward the bearded man, his jaws snapping inches from the man's flailing boots. Eli's boots skidded across the floor. He was a strong man, powerfully built, but he was losing ground. The sheer kinetic energy of the terrified, enraged Pitbull was too much. The leather leash was groaning, the stitches beginning to stretch under the immense strain. "Help! Somebody help!" one of the terrified drunks screamed, cowering behind the front door. "Nobody move," Eli shouted, his face pale with exertion. If the leash snapped, people were going to die. He knew it. The dog knew it. He dug his heels into the linoleum, wrapping the chain around his forearm for better leverage, the metal biting into his skin. "Titan, down, down." The dog ignored him. The noise, the screaming, the smell of fear. It was a sensory overload that drove the animal further into a blind frenzy. Titan lunged again, pulling Eli another foot forward. The heavy metal clasp attaching the leash to the collar began to bend. Elena watched from the center of the diner, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She saw the terror in the drunk's eyes. She saw the panicked exertion on Eli's face. But more importantly, she looked at the dog. She didn't see a monster. She saw a profoundly traumatized animal. The dog wasn't attacking out of malice. Its eyes were wide with white-rimmed panic. Its ears were pinned flat against its skull. Titan wasn't trying to murder. He was trying to neutralize a perceived threat in a chaotic environment. The metal clasp on the leash let out a sharp, metallic ping. It was giving way. Eli saw it. A look of genuine horror flashed across the Mafia boss's face. He reached toward his waistband, his hand instinctively going for the heavy firearm concealed there. He was going to shoot his own dog to save the patrons. "No!" Elena screamed. Before logic or fear could stop her, she dropped the towel. She didn't run away. She didn't hide. She walked directly into the center of the aisle, placing herself squarely between the frenzied, lunging Pitbull and the terrified men cowering by the door. Time seemed to slow down, stretching into agonizing, microscopic fractions of a second. The harsh fluorescent lights hummed violently overhead. The smell of spilled coffee and rain mixed with the sharp metallic tang of fear sweat. "Elena, get out of the way!" Eli bellowed, his voice raw with panic. He was struggling desperately, his polished shoes sliding another inch across the wet floor. His hand was still hovering over his waistband, agonizing over the impossible choice he was about to make. Elena ignored him. She ignored the screaming drunks behind her. She locked her eyes on the floor, specifically staring at the cracked linoleum tiles just inches from Titan's frantically scrambling front paws. Rule number 1, she thought, her pulse thundering in her ears. Never make eye contact. Eye contact is a challenge. She stopped exactly 3 feet out of the dog's lunging range. Slowly, deliberately, she sank to her knees. The floor was cold and sticky, but she didn't care. She lowered her body, making herself as small and non-threatening as possible. She turned her body slightly sideways, presenting a softer profile to the enraged animal. "Hey," she said. Her voice was not loud. It was not a command. It was a soft, melodic hum, pitched low and steady. It was the exact opposite of the chaotic screaming echoing around the room. Titan lunged again, his jaws snapping violently just inches from Elena's face. The sheer force of the air pushed back her hair. The dog's golden eyes were wild, unseeing, completely consumed by the red mist of panic. "Hey, big guy," Elena murmured again, keeping the low, vibrating frequency in her chest. "It's okay. Nobody's fighting." She slowly raised her right hand. She didn't reach out to touch him. That would be a death sentence. Instead, she kept her arm tucked close to her body, her palm facing upward, fingers curled inward, offering the back of her hand. It was a gesture of total vulnerability. "Eleanor, move!" Eli yelled, his voice cracking. He gave another massive yank on the chain, pulling Titan back a few inches. The dog choked, coughing violently against the spiked collar, before rearing up again. "Let the tension go, Eli," Elena said sharply, without looking away from the floor. "Are you insane? He'll kill you? You're strangling him. You're making him panic more. Give him an inch of slack. Now," she ordered, her voice cutting through the noise with startling authority. For a fraction of a second, Eli hesitated. The instinct to control, to dominate, was ingrained in his very bones. But he looked at the waitress, kneeling calmly in the path of destruction, and something in her absolute certainty forced his hand. He released the death grip on the chain, allowing it to drop just a few inches, releasing the choking pressure on Titan's throat. The sudden release of tension caught the dog off guard. Titan dropped to all fours, his heavy chest heaving, thick ropes of saliva dripping onto the floor. He let out a deafening, thunderous bark directly into Elena's face. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She just kept humming that low, steady note. Slowly, she moved her hand an inch closer. "It's just noise, Titan," she whispered softly. "Just stupid noise. You're okay. You're a good boy." The dog's frantic barking shifted into a deep, vibrating growl. He stepped forward, his massive head lowering, sniffing the air aggressively around her hand. The heat radiating from the animal was immense. Elena could smell the raw beef on his breath, mixed with the iron scent of his own bleeding gums from the collar. The entire diner held its breath. The silence was absolute, broken only by the ragged, heavy panting of the Pitbull. Titan took another half step forward. His wet, black nose, scarred from old fights, brushed against the back of Elena's knuckles. Elena didn't move. She kept her breathing slow, matching the rhythm she wanted the dog to adopt. She projected calm, letting all the tension drain from her shoulders. She remembered the dogs in her old neighborhood, the ones thrown into the pits, the ones who only knew human hands as instruments of pain. They just wanted to know they weren't going to be hit. The growling slowly, agonizingly, began to subside. It devolved into a low, confused whine. Titan sniffed her hand again, deeper this time, his whiskers brushing against her skin. Then, incredibly, the dog's pinned ears flicked forward. The rigid, corded muscles along his spine began to relax. He took one more step, entirely closing the distance, and pressed his massive, blocky head firmly into the palm of Elena's hand. A collective, shuddering gasp echoed through the diner. Elena slowly, carefully, turned her hand over, running her fingers gently along the side of the dog's jaw, avoiding the sensitive top of his head. "There you go," she whispered, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "You're just a big baby, aren't you?" Titan let out a long, heavy sigh, his entire body deflating. He leaned his weight against her knee, effectively pinning her to the floor. But the aggression was entirely gone. He was seeking comfort. Behind her, Eli stood frozen, his chest heaving, the slack leash hanging limply from his bleeding hand. He stared at the waitress on the floor, his dark, calculating eyes wide, with an emotion he hadn't felt in decades. Pure, unadulterated shock. The adrenaline crash in the diner was palpable. It felt as though the air pressure had suddenly changed, leaving everyone lightheaded and dizzy. The three drunken men, realizing they had miraculously escaped a mauling, scrambled backward out the heavy glass door, disappearing into the rainy night without a backward glance. The few remaining patrons slowly peeked out from behind booths and over counters, staring in disbelief at the scene unfolding in the center aisle. Elena remained on her knees for a long time, her hand resting rhythmically against Titan's broad, scarred chest. The dog had closed his eyes, his heavy breathing syncing perfectly with her slow, calming strokes. Eventually, she gave him one last firm pat on the shoulder. "All right, big guy. Back to your spot," she murmured softly. Titan opened his eyes, looked at her for a moment, and then slowly stood up. He turned, shook his massive frame, causing his collar to rattle loudly, and ambled back toward the corner booth, slipping quietly beneath the table, as if nothing had happened. Elena let out a breath she felt she had been holding for an eternity. Her knees ached as she pushed herself up from the sticky floor. She brushed off her jeans, picked up the discarded towel, and turned to face Eli. The Mafia boss was still standing in the aisle. His charcoal suit was rumpled, his tie slightly askew, and a thin line of blood trickled down his forearm where the metal chain had bitten into his skin. He was staring at her, his expression unreadable, a complex mask of awe, confusion, and lingering adrenaline. "You should get that hand cleaned up," Elena said, her voice remarkably steady, though her hands were trembling slightly as she gripped the towel. She walked over to where the water glass had shattered and began carefully picking up the large, jagged pieces of glass. Eli didn't move to help. He simply watched her, his eyes tracking her every movement. "How did you do that?" he asked. His voice was quiet, lacking its usual commanding edge. It was the voice of a man who had just witnessed a magic trick he couldn't decipher. Elena dumped the broken glass into a nearby bus tub. "He wasn't trying to attack them," she said plainly, not looking up. He was scared. The noise, the sudden movement, it triggered a panic response. When you pulled back on his neck, you validated his fear. You told him there was something to fight. "He's trained to kill," Eli stated, the words heavy and cold. "He doesn't feel fear." Elena stopped wiping the floor and looked up at him, her eyes locking onto his. "Every living thing feels fear, Eli. Even the ones trained not to show it. He was just trying to protect you. I just showed him he didn't have to." Eli fell silent. The words seemed to strike something deep within him, chipping away at the impenetrable armor he wore so perfectly. He looked down at his bleeding hand, then at the booth where his dog was quietly resting. Without a word, he reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, silver money clip holding a massive wad of $100 bills. He peeled off 5 crisp hundreds and dropped them onto the counter near the register. "For the broken glass." "And your trouble," Eli said, his voice returning to its usual flat, authoritative tone. He was retreating back into his shell, using money to build the wall back up. Elena looked at the cash, then back at him. She walked behind the counter, picked up the $500, and walked back to him. She held the money out. "The glass costs $3 to replace," Elena said firmly. "And I don't need a tip for doing my job." Eli stared at the money in her hand, his jaw clenching. Nobody refused his money. Refusing his money was an insult, a rejection of his power. "Take the money, Elena." "No," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "I'm not one of your guys. You can't pay me to forget what just happened. Keep your money, Eli. Just buy him a harness instead of that spiked collar. It's hurting his throat." She dropped the bills onto the table in front of him, turned around, and walked back into the kitchen to grab a mop. Eli stood in the aisle for a long moment, the ambient noise of the diner slowly returning around him. He looked at the discarded money on the table. He looked at the swinging kitchen doors. Then he looked beneath the table, where Titan was watching him with wide, intelligent eyes. Slowly, the most powerful and feared man in the city reached down and unclipped the heavy metal chain from the spiked collar. He gathered his documents, slipped the money back into his pocket, and tapped his leg twice. Titan emerged from beneath the table. The two of them walked out of the diner, the bell chiming a cheerful goodbye behind them. When Elena came back out with the mop, the booth was empty. The only sign they had been there was the half-eaten rare steak and the heavy, spiked leather collar left sitting perfectly in the center of the table. The rhythm of Carmine's diner returned to normal over the next few days. The late-night crowd rotated through its usual cast of characters: the insomniacs, the graveyard shift workers, and the occasional lost soul seeking warmth. But the atmosphere had subtly shifted. The story of the waitress who stared down the Mafia boss's beast had spread through the underground grapevine with astonishing speed. People looked at Elena differently now. There was a quiet, unspoken respect in their eyes, tinged with a healthy dose of apprehension. 4 days after the incident, the bell above the door chimed at precisely 2 a.m. Elena was wiping down the espresso machine. She didn't turn around immediately, but the sudden hush that fell over the diner told her everything she needed to know. She turned slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. Eli stood in the doorway. He was wearing a dark navy suit this time, without a tie. He looked even more exhausted than before, dark circles bruising the skin under his eyes. But what caught Elena's attention was the dog. Titan was walking by his side, but the thick, spiked leather collar was gone. In its place was a sturdy, padded, tactical harness that wrapped comfortably around his broad chest. The heavy chain had been replaced by a thick nylon leash. Eli's eyes found Elena behind the counter. He didn't say a word. He simply walked toward his usual booth in the back corner. As they passed the counter, Titan suddenly stopped. Eli tugged gently on the leash, but the dog planted his massive paws on the linoleum, refusing to move. Titan turned his large, blocky head toward Elena. He let out a soft, high-pitched whine, his tail giving a slow, tentative wag. Eli looked from the dog to the waitress, his expression a mixture of profound annoyance and quiet resignation. He let the leash go slack. Instantly, Titan trotted over to the counter. He pushed his heavy nose against the swinging gate, looking up at Elena with wide, expectant golden eyes. Elena couldn't help the small smile that broke across her face. She pushed the gate open and knelt down. "Hey, big guy. Look at you," she murmured softly. Titan practically collapsed against her legs, burying his massive head into her stomach. He let out a deep, rumbling groan of contentment as she scratched the sweet spot just behind his ears. The terrifying beast of the underworld was acting like an overgrown, affection-starved puppy. Eli stood a few feet away, his hands buried deep in his pockets, watching the interaction with intense, calculating eyes. He had spent years training this animal to be a weapon, to trust no one, to react to the world with hostility. And yet, in the span of 4 days, this tired waitress in a stained apron had completely undone it. "He's been looking for you," Eli said, his voice low, lacking its usual rough edge. Eleanor looked up, her hands still buried in the dog's thick coat. "He just likes the fact that I don't smell like fear and expensive cologne," she said, a hint of teasing in her voice. It was a risky comment. People didn't tease Eli. But to her surprise, the corner of his mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile she had ever seen him produce. "I bought the harness," Eli noted, gesturing vaguely toward the dog. "I saw. It's much better for his trachea." The spikes were barbaric. "They served a purpose," Eli replied defensively, his walls instantly going back up. "Intimidation is a necessary tool in my line of work." Elena stood up, wiping dog hair off her apron. "Maybe, but you don't need to break something to make it strong, Eli. Sometimes treating things with a little decency makes them more loyal than fear ever could." She turned around and grabbed her notepad. "Usual? Steak and eggs, rare? And a bowl of beef for him?" Eli stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy blanket. He was a man who lived and breathed fear. It was his currency. To hear someone challenge the very foundation of his existence so casually while pouring coffee was entirely disorienting. "Yeah," Eli finally said, walking over to his booth. "The usual." From that night on, a new, unspoken arrangement settled into place. Eli began coming into the diner 3 nights a week. Always during Elena's shift, he would sit in the back booth, drink his black coffee, and review his documents. And Titan, the terrifying, untouchable Pitbull, would spend the entire 2 hours lying directly under Elena's feet behind the counter, perfectly content to be stepped over as she worked. They didn't talk much at first, but as the weeks turned into months, the silence between them grew comfortable. Sometimes, Eli would ask her about her life. He learned she was paying off massive medical debts from her late mother's illness. He learned she had grown up in the rougher parts of the South Side. In return, Elena learned small fragments about the man behind the monster. She learned he hated the taste of the expensive liquor he always bought. She learned he hadn't slept a full night in 5 years. She learned that Titan was the only living thing he trusted enough to turn his back on. Without realizing it, the brightly lit, grease-stained diner had become neutral territory. It was the one place in the city where Eli didn't have to be the boss, and Titan didn't have to be a weapon. But neutral territory only exists if the rest of the world respects it. And in Eli's world, respect was always temporary. It was a cold, bitter Tuesday in late November. The rain had turned to sleet, rattling against the diner's windows like thrown gravel. The diner was unusually empty, save for a solitary truck driver nursing a stale cup of coffee in the front booth. Elena was behind the counter, absent-mindedly scratching Titan's back with her foot as she balanced the register drawer. Eli was in his usual booth, deep in a hushed, intense phone conversation. His face was thunderous, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. Elena felt the shift in the atmosphere before she saw anything. It was a cold, prickly sensation at the base of her neck, an instinct honed by years of living in environments where violence could erupt without warning. She looked toward the front door. 3 men were standing outside, framed by the neon glow of the diner's sign. They weren't moving to come in. They were just standing in the freezing sleet, staring through the glass, their eyes scanning the interior. They wore heavy dark coats, but the way the fabric hung awkwardly over their hips screamed that they were heavily armed. They didn't have the tired slouch of late-night workers. They had the tense, coiled posture of predators. Titan felt it too. The heavy dog suddenly scrambled out from beneath the counter, his claws clicking sharply on the linoleum. He didn't run to the door. He ran straight to Eli's booth, planting himself firmly in front of the table, his body rigid, his hackles raised high along his spine, a low, continuous growl, like the rumble of an earthquake, vibrated from his chest. Eli snapped his phone shut, his eyes darting to the dog, and then immediately tracking Titan's gaze to the front window. The blood drained from Eli's face. He stood up slowly, sliding his right hand smoothly inside his suit jacket. "Elena," Eli said, his voice barely above a whisper, but cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "Go to the kitchen. Lock the heavy steel door. Do not come out." "Who are they?" Elena asked, her heart beginning to hammer a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Rivals," Eli said grimly. "They tracked me. I'm without my detail tonight. Just go, Elena. Now." But Elena didn't move. She looked at the three men outside. They were spreading out, covering the front entrance. She knew the layout of Carmine's better than anyone. The kitchen door was heavy, yes, but the back alley exit was currently blocked by the morning delivery truck. If those men came in, Eli was boxed in. There was no escape route. The brass bell chimed. The three men stepped inside. The freezing air rushed in with them, carrying the smell of ozone and impending violence. The leader, a tall man with a scarred cheek and dead, empty eyes, smiled. It was a terrifying, hollow expression. "Hello, Eli," the man said, his voice smooth and deadly. "You're a hard man to find without your dogs." He glanced down at Titan, who was snarling viciously now, saliva flying from his jaws. "Well, except this one." "You're making a mistake, Marcus," Eli said, his voice cold, steady, devoid of the panic he had shown weeks ago with the dog. He was completely in his element now. "You do this here. It's public. The noise will bring cops. Sleet's coming down hard." "Keeps the noise muffled," Marcus replied casually, unbuttoning his heavy coat to reveal the matte black grip of a suppressed handgun tucked into his waistband. The two men behind him mirrored the action. "Besides, we won't be long. Leave the waitress out of it," Eli ordered, stepping slightly out of the booth to draw their attention away from the counter. Marcus glanced at Elena, dismissing her instantly. She's already forgotten what she saw. Titan barked a deafening, explosive sound and lunged forward a foot, placing himself directly between Marcus and Eli. The dog was ready to die for his master. "Shoot the mutt first," Marcus ordered his men. Time fractured. The two men behind Marcus drew their weapons, bringing the suppressors up to aim squarely at Titan's chest. Eli drew his own weapon, moving to step in front of the dog. But before a single trigger could be pulled, Elena moved. She didn't run to the kitchen. She didn't cower. She grabbed the massive, industrial stainless steel carafe of scalding hot coffee from the burner. It held 2 gallons of liquid kept at near boiling temperatures. With a scream that tore from the bottom of her lungs, Elena hurled the entire heavy carafe over the counter, aiming directly for the 2 men raising their guns at the dog. The heavy metal carafe sailed through the air, flipping end over end. The lid detached mid-flight, unleashing a torrential wave of near-boiling pitch-black coffee directly into the faces and chests of the 2 armed men. The screams were immediate and agonizing. The scalding liquid hit them with the force of a physical blow, blistering skin instantly. One man dropped his suppressed pistol, clawing frantically at his face, blindly stumbling backward into a booth. The other fired wildly into the ceiling, the silenced thwip sound barely registering over his shrieks of pain. "Titan! Attack!" Eli roared, seizing the momentary chaos. The command wasn't needed. The Pitbull was already a blur of gray muscle. Titan launched himself through the air, bypassing the blinded men and tackling the leader, Marcus directly in the chest. 120 pounds of canine fury slammed into the man, sending them both crashing to the linoleum floor. Marcus's gun fired, a suppressed thwip that shattered the front window, spiderwebbing the thick glass. Titan's jaws clamped down violently on Marcus's right forearm, the sickening sound of bone crunching echoing over the chaos. Marcus screamed, punching wildly at the dog's scarred head with his free hand. Eli didn't hesitate. He vaulted over the table, closing the distance to the blinded man who was still clutching his burned face. With terrifying, calculated precision, Eli brought the heavy grip of his own pistol down against the man's temple. The man collapsed instantly, unconscious before he hit the floor. Elena scrambled backward, her breathing ragged, adrenaline pumping so hard her vision was blurring at the edges. She grabbed a heavy cast-iron frying pan from the kitchen pass-through, her knuckles white. The third man, recovering from the initial shock of the hot coffee, wiped his blistering face with his sleeve. His eyes were wide with rage. He saw Eli standing over his fallen comrade and raised his weapon. Eli left, Elena screamed. Eli spun, but he was a fraction of a second too late. The man fired. The bullet grazed the side of Eli's ribcage, tearing through his suit jacket and drawing a bright streak of crimson. Eli grunted, stumbling backward against the diner counter, his own gun slipping from his grasp and skittering across the floor. The gunman took a step forward, aiming for a kill shot. Suddenly, a blur of gray slammed into the back of his knees. Titan, having realized his master was in danger, had abandoned the crippled leader and charged the gunman. The dog's powerful jaws snapped onto the man's calf, dragging him violently backward. The man screamed, losing his footing and crashing hard onto his back. He panicked, kicking wildly at the dog. He aimed his gun downward at the Pitbull. "No!" Elena yelled. Acting purely on instinct, she vaulted over the low swinging gate of the counter. She swung the heavy cast-iron frying pan with every ounce of strength she possessed. The thick metal connected squarely with the gunman's wrist with a sickening crack. The gun fired harmlessly into the floorboards as it was knocked from his mangled hand. Titan released the leg, immediately repositioning to pin the man down by the throat, growling violently, waiting for the command to finish it. The diner was suddenly plunging back into a terrifying, heavy silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors and the agonized groans of the wounded. Marcus, the leader, was dragging himself toward the shattered front door, his right arm a mangled, bloody mess. He looked back, his eyes wide with fear as he saw his two men neutralized, the Mafia boss standing over him, and the terrifying waitress standing over the other holding a frying pan like a battle axe. Eli picked up his gun from the floor. He walked slowly toward Marcus, pressing the barrel directly against the man's forehead. "Tell whoever sent you," Eli whispered, his voice devoid of all humanity, "that Carmine's is off limits." Marcus nodded frantically, his face pale. Eli stepped back, lowering the gun. "Run!" Marcus scrambled to his feet, clutching his ruined arm, and stumbled out into the freezing sleet. The man Elena had burned grabbed his unconscious partner by the collar, dragging him desperately out the door, leaving a trail of blood and spilled coffee in their wake. As the door swung shut, the absolute reality of what had just happened crashed down over the diner. Elena dropped the frying pan. It clattered loudly against the floor. She staggered backward, her knees finally giving out, sliding down the side of the counter until she was sitting on the wet floor. She was shaking uncontrollably, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. Eli stood in the center of the room. He looked at the shattered window, the blood smeared across the linoleum, the overturned tables. Then he looked at his side. The white shirt beneath his jacket was stained deep crimson, the blood steadily dripping down his leg. "Titan," Eli coughed, his voice tight with pain. "Release." The dog stepped back from the pool of blood, his chest heaving. He shook himself, spraying crimson droplets across the floor. Then, slowly, the dog limped toward Elena. Elena looked up. There was a deep, ugly slash across Titan's shoulder, where one of the men had managed to catch him with a knife during the chaos. Blood was matting his gray fur. "Oh God, buddy," Elena choked out, tears finally breaking through her so. She reached out, pulling the massive bloody head into her lap. Ignoring the mess, Titan whimpered softly, licking the back of her trembling hand. Eli slowly walked over to them. He leaned heavily against the counter, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor beside her. He pressed his hand hard against his bleeding ribs, his face pale and drawn. He looked at the waitress, her apron covered in blood and coffee, cradling his terrifying, untouchable dog like a newborn child. "You threw a pot of boiling coffee at armed hitmen," Eli said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and quiet awe. Elena let out a wet, breathless laugh, wiping tears from her eyes. "You said they were going to shoot the dog, Eli. What was I supposed to do?" Eli closed his eyes, resting his head back against the cabinet. For the first time in his life, the walls were entirely gone. He wasn't the boss. He was just a bleeding man sitting on the floor of a wrecked diner, entirely dependent on a waitress who possessed more courage than any soldier he had ever employed. The next hour was a blur of frantic, hushed activity. Eli had made one brief phone call, speaking in a low-coded language to someone on the other end. "No cops. Send the cleaner. Send the doc to my safe house. We have a mess at Carmine's." Elena had immediately shifted into survival mode. She locked the heavy deadbolts on the front door and pulled down the thick metal security blinds, plunging the diner into a dim, secluded gloom. She ran to the back, grabbing the heavy industrial first aid kit kept near the chemical closet. "We need to stop the bleeding before you move," Elena said, dropping to her knees beside Eli. She tore open his ruined suit jacket and ripped his white shirt open. The graze on his ribs was deep, a jagged trench of torn flesh that was bleeding sluggishly but consistently. Eli winced as she pressed a thick wad of sterile gauze aggressively against the wound. "Keep pressure on this," she ordered, grabbing his hand and forcing it onto the gauze. "Do not let up." Without waiting for his response, she pivoted to the dog. Titan was lying on his side, his breathing shallow. The knife wound on his shoulder was deep, cutting through the thick muscle. Elena's hands trembled. Titan let out a sharp yelp and tried to scramble up, but Eli reached out with his free hand, gripping the dog's snout firmly. "Hold him," Eli commanded softly. "It's all right, Titan. Hold." Elena worked quickly, wrapping a thick pressure bandage tightly around the dog's massive chest and shoulder, securing it tightly. She wiped the blood from her hands onto her already ruined apron and sat back, her chest heaving. The diner was silent again, but it was a heavy, traumatized silence. The smell of copper blood mixed sickeningly with the aroma of the spilled coffee. Eli leaned his head back against the counter, watching her. His eyes were dark, clouded with pain and an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. "Why did you do it, Elena?" he asked quietly, his voice raspy. "Do what?" she asked, aggressively wiping a stain off her jeans, refusing to look at him. "Step in. You could have hid in the kitchen. You could have let them take me. It's not your world. It's not your fight." Elena stopped wiping. She looked around the wrecked diner, at the shattered glass and the overturned tables. This was her sanctuary, and his violence had bled all over it. "You're right. It's not my world," she said, her voice trembling with leftover adrenaline and sudden, fierce anger. "But he is in my world." She pointed to Titan, who was resting his heavy head on her thigh. "And you're a pain in the ass, Eli. But you're a regular. Nobody shoots my regulars." A slow, genuine smile spread across Eli's pale face. It changed his entire demeanor. softening the hard lines around his eyes, making him look surprisingly human. "You're a terrifying woman, Elena," he murmured. "I'm a waitress trying to pay off debt," she corrected sharply. "And right now, you owe me a new coffee carafe, a front window, and about 3 gallons of bleach." Eli's smile faded into a look of profound seriousness. "They won't come back here. I'll make sure of it. But tonight, you crossed a line. You involved yourself. In my world, that puts a target on your back." Elena felt a cold chill run down her spine, but she held his gaze. "I'm not afraid of shadows, Eli. I grew up in them. You should be afraid of mine," he said quietly. He pushed himself up, wincing in agony as his ribs protested. He stood unsteadily, leaning against the counter. "My guys are 5 minutes away. They're going to clean this up. They're going to give you an envelope with enough cash to fix this place and pay off every cent of your debt." Elena stood up, crossing her arms defensively. "I told you before, I don't want your money to keep quiet." "It's not to keep quiet," Eli said, his voice turning cold, adopting the mantle of the boss once again. He was deliberately putting the wall back up. He was severing the tie to protect her. "It's a severance. You don't work here anymore. You take the money. You move out of your neighborhood, and you forget you ever met me." Elena stared at him, stung by the sudden, harsh rejection. "You can't just dictate my life, Eli." "I just did," he said flatly. "It's the only way to keep you safe from the mess I brought to your door." He looked down at the dog. "Come on, Titan. Let's go." Eli limped heavily toward the back door of the diner, where he knew his men would be waiting in the alley. He expected the familiar thud-thud of heavy paws following right behind him. He reached the door and pushed it open, the freezing alley air rushing in. He looked back. Titan hadn't moved. The massive Pitbull was still sitting by the counter, leaning heavily against Elena's legs. The dog looked at Eli, then looked up at Elena, and let out a soft, low whine. "Titan." "Here," Eli commanded, his voice sharp. The dog lowered his head, his ears pinning back in submission. But he didn't take a single step toward his master. He pressed himself closer to the waitress, his thick tail tucking between his legs. The beast had made his choice. He knew who the safe harbor was. Eli stood in the open doorway, the freezing wind whipping his coat around him. He looked at the dog, his only companion, his protector, refusing to leave the side of the woman who had saved them both. He looked at Elena, who was staring back at him, a defiant, heartbroken look in her eyes. For the first time in his entire life, the untouchable Mafia boss had absolutely no idea what to do. The silence in the diner was absolute, broken only by the howling wind rushing through the open back door. Eli stood frozen, his hand gripping the doorframe so tightly his knuckles were white. The pain radiating from his ribs was secondary to the sharp, unfamiliar ache blooming in his chest. He looked at Titan. The dog, trained to execute commands with lethal, unquestioning loyalty, was blatantly defying him. But as Eli stared at the animal, he realized Titan wasn't rebelling. He was terrified. The dog had almost lost his master tonight, had suffered pain, and now he was refusing to leave the one person who had offered unconditional comfort instead of commands. Elena slowly knelt back down, gently resting her hand on Titan's uninjured shoulder. She didn't look at Eli. She kept her eyes focused on the dog. "He's hurt, Eli," Elena said softly, "and he's scared. He knows if he walks out that door with you, he goes back to being a weapon." Eli's jaw tightened. "He belongs to me." "He's not a gun," Elena snapped, her eyes flashing as she finally looked up at him. "He's a living thing, and right now, he's telling you he's done fighting your battles." Eli stepped back into the diner, letting the heavy metal door swing shut behind him, cutting off the freezing wind. He limped slowly back toward the counter, every step an agony. He stopped a few feet away, looking down at the strange tableau, the bloodied waitress and the scarred, trembling beast. He had spent his life accumulating power, building a fortress of fear to ensure nobody could ever touch him. But looking at Elena, he realized his fortress was a prison, and he had dragged his dog into the cell with him. "If I stay," Eli said, his voice dropping to a harsh, vulnerable whisper, "if I keep coming around, they will use you to get to me. Marcus is alive. He knows you mean something." The admission hung in the air, heavy and fragile. "You mean something." It was the closest the Mafia boss could come to a confession of the heart. Elena stood up, brushing the dirt from her knees. She stepped over Titan and closed the distance between herself and Eli. She didn't flinch away from the blood, or the gun still holstered at his hip, or the terrifying reputation that preceded him. She looked directly into the dark, exhausted eyes of the man beneath the armor. "I've spent my whole life being invisible, Eli. Wiping down tables, serving coffee, watching people live real lives while I just survived," Elena said, her voice remarkably steady. "Tonight, I didn't hide. I made a choice. It was a stupid choice," Eli countered weakly. "Maybe," she agreed, a faint smile touching her lips. "But it was mine. You don't get to come in here, bleed all over my floor, make your dog fall in love with me, and then tell me to run away." Eli stared at her, completely disarmed. He was used to people cowering, negotiating, or plotting. He didn't know how to handle absolute fearless honesty. "So, what happens now?" Eli asked, the raw uncertainty in his voice stripping away the last remnants of the formidable boss. "Now," Elena said softly, reaching out and gently touching the uninjured side of his jacket, "your cleaners come and fix my diner. Your doctor stitches you up. And then you figure out how to be a man who doesn't need to carry a spiked collar to feel safe." She looked down at Titan, who was watching them intensely, his tail giving a slow, hopeful thump against the floor. "And he stays with me," Elena stated, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation, "until you can give him a home instead of a headquarters. He can sleep behind the counter. I'll buy him the expensive kibble." Eli looked at the dog. He knew she was right. His world was too dangerous right now. If Marcus retaliated, the safe house wouldn't be safe. Carmine's, under the protection of his men from the outside, with Elena on the inside, was ironically the safest place for the animal. He looked back at Elena. He saw the fierce determination in her eyes, the protective stance she took over his dog, and the terrifying, dutiful realization that she was willing to stand in the crossfire for them. Eli slowly reached out. He didn't reach for his money clip. He didn't reach for his gun. He gently rested his hand over hers, where it still lay against his jacket. His hand was rough, stained with blood, but his touch was incredibly gentle. "Okay," Eli whispered. It was a single word, but it was a surrender. It was the collapse of an empire and the beginning of something entirely new. An hour later, the black vans arrived. Quiet, efficient men scrubbed the floors, replaced the shattered glass, and discreetly escorted a heavily bandaged Eli into the back of a waiting car. Before he got in, Eli stopped. He looked back through the pristine, newly replaced window of Carmine's diner. Elena was behind the counter, a fresh apron tied around her waist. She was pouring a cup of coffee, the steam curling into the warm air, and curled up on a thick, makeshift bed of blankets directly beneath her feet. The terrifying, untamable beast of the underworld was fast asleep, finally at peace. Eli pulled his coat tight against the cold, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. He got into the car, ready to face the war waiting for him in the shadows, knowing for the first time in his life he had a real reason to survive it and come back to the light. Sometimes